Hello everybody, this is Tip Top MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, I'm going to be looking at some of the banned cards from Magic and trying to fix them so that they could be returned in this state. Now, normally Wizards of the Coast doesn't do errating, and I'm not saying they should go change these cards. This is more of a retrospect of how could they achieve a very similar effect without without it being a completely overpowered card. So a lot of that comes down to looking at what formats it's banned in, why it was banned, and how you can still lower the power level while keeping the idea of the card alive. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Cauldron Familiar, which was banned in Standard. And honestly, the biggest reason it was banned in Standard was because it created too many triggers, and it led to MTG Arena games slowing down because you would have to wait about 5 minutes for them to sacrifice their cat about 5 times. So it was mostly banned for that reason. And so this one simple change, first off, this was an uncommon. Maybe if you made this change, it would be bumped down to common. The one on the right says it's a common. That's because it's from Jumpstart, where it did get bumped down to a common. But what I did is essentially I just got rid of the whole entering the battlefield, losing a life, and gaining a life, and I upped its power to be a 2/1. That way you have this resilient 1-cost blocker, an attacker that can come back from the graveyard, but the whole point of like flickering it isn't really going to do anything unless you have other sacrifice triggers. So I could definitely still see this being a problem. And I guess it does remove some of the fun of the card, but I think that it would have fixed a lot of the problems. You still would have had another food payoff, and, it still fits the theme of coming back. It just disincentivizes you from just looping it, unless you have some other ability that cares about, like, when you sack something. So I think that would be one fix. I think another fix could be this. So this one's a little bit more complicated, but it says, when Cauldron Familiar is sacrificed, exile it from your graveyard. Return it to your graveyard at the beginning of your next end step. So the idea here is that when it becomes sacrificed, it exiles itself. And what this would do is it means if you have 4 Witches of It in one Cauldron Familiar, you can only sacrifice the cat one time because it's going to exile itself. You may need to adjust the wording so that you can't, in response to this ability, put it on the battlefield. So there may need to be a little bit of a wording change, but generally I think that if you made it so when it gets sacrificed, you can't return it to the battlefield the turn that it died, it would mean that for every cat you need to have a different oven, and I think that would have reduced a lot of the issues with it, and it would have made it a more balanced card. Now, with this version of the card, you could add that each opponent loses 1 life, but at that point it gets very complicated with the number of words, so maybe you say whenever it's sacrificed, you can add it maybe to that ability somewhere, but I think you could reintroduce the lose a life and gain a life if you do the whole it only, comes back at your end step or whatever. So I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's move on to the next card. The next card we are going to be talking about is Fires of Invention. This one was banned in both Standard and Historic for just being completely a powerhouse. So let's take a look at some changes that you can do. So you can see the original on the right, new one on the left. So first off, I kind of split it up. So this one on the left is kind of just a different way to do it. I thought it was just kind of an interesting one. So normally you can only cast 2 spells per turn and you can't cast them on your opponent's turn. Well, I said you can only cast spells during your turn, and I don't have the you can only cast 2 spells. And honestly, this was one of those ones where I would need to play with it in order to be able to tell. But what I did is I said, whenever you cast a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, sacrifice a land. So the idea is that, yeah, you can only cast spells with CMC equal to the number of lands or, less. And so, but you can do that for free. But if you do that for free, you're sacrificing land. So you can cast a 6-drop for free, but then you're only going to be able to cast 5 drops. The disadvantage here is that it means that every turn, theoretically, if you played a land, played some spell without paying its mana cost, sacrifice the land or whatever, you can then always get a free spell and use all of your mana. So I do think it could be more powerful in some regards, but I think that it would keep it in check a little bit, because the issue was once you got up to 5 or 6 lands, you would just never need lands again. But this requires you to keep lands entering the battlefield, and if it doesn't happen, this card isn't going to be doing much for you other than stopping you from casting things. So I definitely think that is an interesting solution, but I don't know if it would necessarily fix the problem. I think it would make it a slightly better and balanced card, but I don't know if that would necessarily fix the problem. And actually, I guess it could lead to more disastrous results. But I think one that would make a little bit more sense is keeping the original clause of you can only cast spells during your turn, but adding one little thing. Now, I still think this would have been a really good card, but you may cast spells with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control without paying their mana cost, as long as you control a permanent of each color in the cast spell. So if you cast, say, Nico Bolas, the one from War of the Spark, you would need a black permanent, a blue permanent, and a red permanent on the battlefield before you can cast it for free. And what this does is it requires you to get a couple things out on the board first. And it also means, and one of the biggest problems with it, is that you could use something to go fetch out of your sideboard cards that weren't even in your colors, but they were just really good and you could cast them for free. So by requiring you to have those permanents on the board, it's kind of requiring you to pick a set of colors and not just be able to cast anything of any color for free. So I think that that is one that could definitely approach the problem that it was having, where, you know, it would just be too consistent because colors don't matter. As long as you got red, you are fine. So I think that that would definitely be an interesting solution, and I think it could still be a powerful card, because obviously Standard and other formats need powerful cards, but they don't need broken cards, and I think this addresses one of the biggest problems with it. So next, let's talk about Once Upon a Time. So again, I have two solutions here. The first one is to keep the bottom part exactly the same, but instead, if this is this first spell you've cast this game, it costs one less to cast. And you might be wondering, why does this affect so many things? First off, this is banned, by the way, in case you didn't know, in Standard, Pioneer, Modern, and Historic. So why would this little change fix it? Well, one of the biggest issues with this is that technically you could have played this in any color deck. It's very similar to Fires of Invention, where it kind of let you get around colors. And so by making it still cost 1 green, it means that you have to be in green to cast it. It also just generally brings the power level of it down, which is definitely needed, but it also definitely makes it so you are required to be in green to cast the card. You can't just throw one of these in your deck and hope you draw it, you know, in your first 7 cards just to get that advantage or whatever. And that was a big problem, is that people were putting these in non-green decks because it was so good and because it was free. So I think that this would really address that problem. Now, another way you could do it is that you could make it so that it's still free if you wanted that part of it to really stay the same, but one change you could make is that you could make it so, like it says here, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature or a land card from among them and put it on top of your library. So instead of putting it directly in your hand, you're putting it on top of your library, which, you know, it still gives you the Once Upon a Time theme. However, instead of it being like a cantrip spell, you're actually losing a card to do this, but you're filtering the next 5 cards. So you're kind of drawing 5 cards in a sense, not really, but it lets you filter the top 5 cards for 0 mana or 2 mana, which I think is a lot more fair and isn't just a free cantrip that you would throw in every green deck. You'd really need to be like looking for a combo piece for this. And so I honestly think this is the preferred solution, but I think both would definitely address the problem. Next, let's talk about a newer one, Omnath, Locus of Creation. So this one is a bit of a longer card. So the first thing I did was I removed the draw card phrase, which I know it's there because they want an ability of each mana color. The gaining 4 life is white, the adding mana is green, the dealing damage is red, and the drawing a card is blue. So what I did is I just kind of got rid of that, and then I said, whenever, you know, I kept the ability to say, whenever the first land enters, you gain 4 life. The second time you add, so you add red, green, white, and blue. And here comes the kicker. This mana can only be spent to cast elemental spells or activated abilities of elementals you control. So the idea here is that, yes, you get to add 4 mana because, you know, everything's in 4s, but you have to use it for elementals, which now means you can't just use that mana to cast ultimatums or whatever. And that was one of the biggest problems, was his mana ability. So if you took that mana ability and limited what the mana could be used for, he could still be really fun as the head of like an elemental landfall deck, and that mana would definitely be really useful there, but it wouldn't be nearly as degenerated as it was in Standard and Historic and Brawl, which this is banned in. And then the third time, obviously, Omnath is going to deal 4 damage. So, yeah, I definitely think this is a pretty good solution. It really limits it. Now, I have one that's a little bit more risky, but could still be interesting. So, The issue with the last one is that you don't have one for each color. So what I did here is I made it so the first time you gain 4 life, the second time you scry 4, which is insane. I just wanted to stick with the 4s. I think you might swap around the 4 damage. I don't know. The third one you deal the 4 damage, and then if it's the 4th time you add a 4 mana. So if you can drop 4 lands down in one turn, you get the 4 mana. It also adds back in a blue effect. I think this could be an interesting attempt, but I think the first one is way more balanced and fixes a lot of the problems that Omnath has, and you could almost add back the draw ability. I just felt like it was a little unnecessary though, so I removed it. Next, let's talk about a different Scourge. We have Uro, who is banned actually only in Standard right now, but what did I do? Well, I changed up his ability. So this one is my less preferred option, but this one just removed the ability to put a land onto the battlefield. So yes, he's still a 6/6 that you can repeatedly cast from your graveyard for 4 mana, and you're still going to get some, card draw. He's going to cantrip. He's going to help you fill out your graveyard by helping you draw cards, and then come back and be a threat. But he doesn't let you put a land on the battlefield. Now, I think this would really ruin what Uro was meant to do. So I think if we can just nerf the amount of land fall or whatever, the amount of ability to put lands on the battlefield, that is better. Now, this one's a little bit more complex, and of course, this was part of a cycle, and so that's part of why it was worded the way it was. But when Uro enters the battlefield, if it escaped, exile this creature and create a token that is a copy of Uro, except it doesn't trigger abilities as it enters the battlefield, otherwise sacrifice it. So the otherwise sacrifices it is in reference to if it escaped, all the way back up there. So the rest of the card is exactly the same. The idea is you're going to cast it. He's going to sacrifice himself. By the way, also both of these I brought down to 5/5s, but not the point. Both of these, you're going to enter the battlefield, draw a card, gain life, put a land down. Then it's going to go to the graveyard. You're going to cast it for its escape cost, and when it enters the battlefield, it's actually going to, create a token copy of itself, get rid of itself, and now that token is on the battlefield. And essentially, that's a big workaround way to say you can only escape Uro once, and then he exiles himself. And so then, what does this fix? Well, it fixes the prolonged games where people just keep recasting Uro. It makes it so that, it's not this thing that's just going to keep coming back, and it doesn't matter what you do, he'll just keep entering the battlefield. And it means that you have to play Uro a lot more strategically. I think it definitely balances the card, and it would have made a lot of sense to make both the Titans like this. Again, wording may need to change, but you get the general idea. Makes a token instead of an actual version of himself, and exiles himself as well. So yeah, let's move on to the next one, which is Winota, who actually is not banned in Standard, but is banned in Historic and Brawl for just being way too consistent. So let's talk about what you can do to change that. So one thing I did here is this one. Okay, this is how I think the card should have been designed, but whenever one or more non-human creatures you control attack. So if you attack with 5 1/1 Thopters, you're not getting 5 individual triggers, you are simply getting 1 trigger, and the rest of the ability is exactly the same. The other one I did was I changed it so whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, you look at the top card. So the two things I did, I either made it so that either it didn't matter the number of creatures that attacked, or that you don't look at 6 cards, you look at 1. And if that 1, you look at it, and if it is a thing, you put it onto the battlefield. I think one thing I missed is putting the card on the bottom. No. It's actually right there. So yeah, no. You're going to look at the top card of your library for each one. So essentially what's going to happen is you're going to attack with 5 1/1 Thopters, look at the top 5 cards of your library, put all humans, which you might be like, whoa, that sounds like an upgrade. But no, because if it was the old Winota, you'd look at the top 30 and put 5 of them. So yeah, I think it would be a definite downgrade, and it would have made it a lot less consistent, a lot less scary, and I think would have fixed it generally. Alright, so the last card we're going to talk about here is Lucky Clover. Lucky Clover copies instants and sorceries, so I did 3 different versions of this. The first one is whenever you cast your first adventure instant or sorcery spell compared to whenever you cast anything. So the idea here is that you're only going to get to copy the first spell, so if you have 4 Lucky Clovers and you cast an adventure, you're not doing that every single time, you're only doing it the first time. I think that would have been fair. I think another way is to just make it legendary. You can only have 1 of them out on the battlefield at a time. That really solves a lot of the issues. Yes, duplicating a spell is very, very powerful, but it was really an issue when you started getting 2 or 3 of them out on the board. And again, there can be powerful cards, just not broken cards. And then the last one is whenever you cast your first spell, and actually I think you could honestly remove first. So whenever you cast an adventure, instant, or sorcery spell each turn, except get rid of each turn, you just copy it. Now you might be wondering, what is the difference here? Well, you'll notice one key line is missing. You may choose new targets for the copy. So the idea here is that you don't get to choose new targets. You know, you have a bounce spell with Brazen Borrower, and you have 2 Lucky Clovers. Normally that means you get to pay 2 mana to bounce 3 things of your opponents, but now it just means you've bounced 1 thing. Yes, this is still useful for some adventures that like tutor things out of your sideboard, but it definitely limits the usage. I mean, yes, you could stomp something and it would duplicate and deal extra damage to that thing, but I think that's a lot more fair in general. So yeah, those are my changes to Lucky Clover, and honestly, those are my changes to banned cards. I know I didn't do all of them, and actually I did a video like this about a year ago at this point, and so I didn't do any of those, so I didn't like touch Oko, who I touched in that video, or anything like that. So yeah, I want to know what you guys think. Do you think any of these changes would have made the cards more appropriate or more balanced? Do you think some of them would have been absolutely trash and no one would have played them with the new changes? What cards would you do you think should be banned that aren't banned right now? I know that's a little off topic, but I'm just curious what you guys think about all of that in the comments down below. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button, subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.